Well, Alicia, I think it's fair to say that a hallmark of the Trump presidency to date, and that's, we're only days into it, has been protests against him and his policies from before he took office and now that he's been issuing executive orders almost daily, from whether in the Oval Office or at various departments around Washington, D.C. And you mentioned these protests, at airports, from JFK to Los Angeles International, Chicago's O'Hare, Seattle Airport, Houston, Texas. Some 90 airports across the country saw protests over the weekend. I was at that one you mentioned in Battery Park last night just to get a sense of the mood and what people are saying. And they are saying that these executive orders do not represent American values. You mentioned, being in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, they don't represent American interests, and that refugees are indeed welcome in the United States, a country essentially built, Alicia, on immigrants that have moved here over the decades and centuries.
Look, Sherwin, now Trump says that in 90 days these visas will be reissued after the so-called safety policies have been implemented or adhered to. But what happens to those now who had already made their travel plans? And maybe explain to us more about these safety policies that he's talking about, Sherwin.
Alicia, the vetting process for resettlement is a rigorous one already, and it can take anything from 2 years to 4 years before a refugee that has gone through the UN's Human Rights High Commissioner for Refugees, and then working in collaboration with countries where they can be resettled, and then you have to take the national legislation of those countries into consideration in terms of how long that process then might last. They involve in the United States multiple interviews, medical screenings, multiple background checks before people are allowed to resettle in the United States. Because if you think about it, the political damage to any administration would be quite severe if they were to allow refugees legal status in the country and then have those very refugees perpetrate an attack against the nation. So the problem also with these executive orders is that they've been applied certainly over the past weekend to people from those 7 countries: Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Iran, Yemen, and Somalia. People, though, with legal status have been affected. They have valid visas, they have either valid refugee status, or they have a U.S. green card which gives them permanent residency in this country. These are the instances that are causing the most ructions and ruptures at these airports, is that people with legal status are now being precluded from enforcing their legal status that they've received either through a visa process at a consulate around the world or through a very stringent resettlement refugee policy that is already in place. So this has been the confusion, and what we've seen from a number of federal judge rulings, starting with one in New York, there was one in Massachusetts, in Washington State on the West Coast, in Virginia, several federal judges, have ordered that no one arriving in the United States now with a legal status, with a visa, with a green card, with a refugee permit, none of them should now be deported or turned away. So that's an important point. So the executive order has to be implemented with those federal rulings now taken into account.
All right, but Sherwin, very quickly now, but looking at how the traditional U.S. allies have started speaking out against these measures, saying, yes, terrorism needs to be fought, but this shouldn't be Trump's excuse to impose this ban. Are we slightly seeing a general shift in his support so early in office? Very quickly, Sherwin.
Well, I think for Donald Trump, and I think this is probably factual, is Donald Trump is most concerned about the people that put him in office. He's not really concerned about people's opinions. 1 million people marched in Washington a week ago. That hasn't swayed Donald Trump at all. Donald Trump is implementing the policies he promised his supporters that he would. We are now, as you mentioned, seeing criticism from EU allies, reciprocal actions being mooted in places like Iran and Iraq, where they will now block U.S. citizens from entering those countries. And I can tell you that in Iraq, for example, a number of U.S. companies have big construction contracts in that country that could be affected here. And we're also seeing, we're waiting for a statement from the Secretary General's office in terms of what happened this weekend. But on Friday, the UN Refugee Agency and the International Organization for Migration has basically called for engagement with the U.S. administration and expressing a hope that its strong leadership role and long tradition of protecting those who are most vulnerable, who flee conflicts, who flee persecution, that tradition will continue. So let's see if they're able to convince this administration to back off from this executive order.
Sherwin, thank you so much for that update. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our U.S. correspondent, and he was telling us what's currently happening with the U.S. protests against Trump's ban on several Muslim-majority countries, which has now led to stranded immigrants at airports across the U.S. Let's take a quick ad break. Your business news are coming up after that.